Let's do a moment review. In Daniel 3, we remember the king commanded false worship. He insisted everybody bow down to the 90-foot golden image that historians believe was of himself, that people were to worship. Nebuchadnezzar was unsuccessful in getting those three Hebrew young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to bow down to the idol. We know he put them in the fiery furnace. We know that Jesus appeared with him. And then that he passed a law that everybody in the whole kingdom was to honor their God. Last week, lesson 7 is about 50 years later. Nebuchadnezzar had passed away, and his son and grandson had become co-rulers of Babylon. His son had absolutely no interest in ruling Babylon, and it seems that he left it in the hands of his son, Belshazzar. And the son had no interest in the God of his grandfather. Idolatry was again the major religion in Babylon. We learned last week that in defiance of God, Belshazzar held a great feast. He invited 1,000 of his lords, in other words, all the big people in all the provinces in his government, along with their ladies. There would have been well over 2,000 people, plus all the people serving at the feast. So you're probably talking 3,000 to 4,000 people. And during that feast, if you remember, he brought the vessels from the archives somewhere that had been taken out of the temple, the golden chalices that were dedicated to God and used by the priest in the temple back in Jerusalem. And he used them to toast his idols, everybody drinking wine and so forth. And we know that Belshazzar knew all of this. He knew his grandfather's history. He knew about the God of Daniel. He knew Nebuchadnezzar spent 7 years of insanity until he converted to the God of heaven. But Belshazzar wanted nothing to do with God. I'm sure it was restrictive on the partying lifestyle he had chosen for himself. And so in the midst of that great feast, using God's sacred vessels, the fingers of a man's hand appeared up on the wall. The room where the feast was held has been unearthed, has been dug up. And it is probably about a half a football field. The size, it's huge. And it would have been dark. They had no electricity, but they had plenty of oil light. So it would have been lit at the bottom, but the top would have been dark. So a fiery fingers writing on the wall would have certainly gotten everybody's attention. The Bible says that Belshazzar's knees knocked together. He was so terrified when nobody could read the message. The queen mother, we don't know if this was Nebuchadnezzar's wife. We don't know exactly who the queen mother was. Most likely it was Nebuchadnezzar's wife. She suggested to Belshazzar to go get Daniel. He was up in his 80s. He had retired from public life, and bring him in because she said he can read the writing on the wall. Last week we learned that the Medes and Persians their armies came under the gate up into the city, killed Belshazzar and everybody that was at the banquet, with the exception of Daniel. In today's lesson, the Medes and the Persians now have captured Babylon. They've taken over Babylon. Remember, this was a huge empire. And now they're setting up their government. It is interesting to me that Daniel was not killed in the slaughter that night. You wonder how much the news about who Daniel was and what he had done had spread throughout the then known world. It is an amazing thing to me that at his age, he was called immediately to serve, to work in the Medo-Persia government. Today now our lesson centers on Daniel chapter 6. Let's remember as we study today that just before Jesus returns, God's people are going to be enticed to worship God falsely. And then we will be prohibited from worshiping God according to his word. God's people are going to stand as firm as Daniel did, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. Because just like Daniel and his friends, we will have developed a strong personal relationship with God. If we don't have that, then we're not going to be saved. We will serve him. We will know that our home is not in this world. And we will be true to God through everything we have to face. First, let's talk about the Medes and Persians who came under the gate the night of Belshazzar's feast. This is a photo of the ruins, if you will note, of Cyrus's palace. Their structures were magnificent. I don't know if you can tell, but all of this was his palace. It's fantastic buildings of Babylon and of the Persians. Cyrus is named in prophecy as the rod in the hand of God for the punishment of Babylon. He was only 25 years old when Babylon fell. In fact, there are 19 verses in the Bible about Cyrus in 4 different books. The mentions in Daniel, Ezra, 2nd Chronicles, and Isaiah, 150 years before he was born. At the fall of Babylon, it was natural for him to allow his 62-year-old uncle Darius, the Mede, to become the first ruler of the conquered empire. But even under the new government, false worship had a direct impact on the life of God's servant, Daniel. While we learn a lot from the book of Daniel, one thing stands out. A relationship with God is the most important thing we can have, regardless of what goes on around us, especially as we enter the last days of this earth's history. And standing faithful to God is the outstanding lesson we learn from the book of Daniel. Today's lesson, we learn that Satan is going to make another attempt to prohibit worship of God. Nebuchadnezzar was brought to a faith in God. Now there's a new regime. They're in power, and Satan wants them to continue to worship false gods. So another attack is planned behind closed doors against God. The Babylonian kingdom, now under control of the Medes and Persians, was vast. I think if you can see the red, all of this belonged to Persia. It was actually the then known world. It had to be organized. And Daniel 6 verse 1 says that Darius and Cyrus immediately organized the 120 provinces of the empire under 120 satraps. That's what they were called. Satraps were or princes of the kingdom. Today we might call them governors of the provinces or of the states. Daniel 6:2 says there were 3 governors over the 120 satraps. Daniel was one of the governors. They brought Daniel out of retirement to serve under the conquerors of Babylon. So each governor had 40 satraps under him. This is an amazing story. Here was a man who served as prime minister under Nebuchadnezzar. Would you think that would happen in America? It would be like whoever the next president is using the president today's cabinet and attorney general. It's like it isn't done. Everybody brings their own government in for loyalty. And yet, Daniel's reputation was so wonderful that Darius and Cyrus immediately put him over in charge as one-third of their kingdom. They had to have known Daniel's history. You got to think what a testimony that is. What a testimony to a righteous character of this servant of God. All of these rulers knew that Daniel could be trusted. All of them knew he ate a healthy diet. I'm sure the gossip in the kingdom was what Daniel would and wouldn't eat. And I'm sure he was probably a very young 80-year-old as he was called back into service. It would have taken many men to oversee such a large territory. The men would also have been overseers of the taxes, of all jobs in the government. They were there to ensure loyalty among the inhabitants. And it wasn't long before the other men working with Daniel in the government hated him. Now, why would all those other government employees in all the other provinces hate Daniel? Why was that? I imagine, if you just look at our government, how people come into the House and into the Senate poor as a church mouse, barely enough money to get themselves elected. They leave rich. Ask yourself how that happens. And I imagine that's the same thing happening back in that government. They probably were skimming off the top of what they collected in taxes. They probably took bribes to put in a good word to get them a government job. And Daniel wouldn't have anything to do with such practices. That must have made all the others hate him. Furthermore, Daniel 6 verse 3 tells us Daniel was preferred by King Darius and his uncle Cyrus. So see, I think they knew about him. He was preferred because he could be trusted absolutely. This was probably more than the other satraps and governors could stand. What would our Congress and Senate today do with an absolutely perfectly honest man or woman? They would levy every charge, every vile thing they could think of against them. If you are a thief, a liar, you're trying to elevate yourself and get rich, you want nothing to do with a godly person. We should remember that when there are smear campaigns going on against a public figure in our government. Daniel 6:4 tells us that they all began trying to gather opposition research on Daniel. They wanted to find a crack somewhere in his godly armor, anything, just to get rid of him, get him out of here, no matter how hard they tried. And I'm sure they tried everything from men to women to children to anything they could tempt him with to get rid of Daniel. But they could find nothing against Daniel. Wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody did every bit of research on you and me they possibly could, and there's absolutely nothing they could say bad about us? After 80 years, because Daniel's well into his 80s now, they wanted to report to the king something bad about Daniel. No matter how hard they tried, there was nothing to report about him. They could not make a case against Daniel. the evil satraps and the other two governors finally decided, okay, there's one area of Daniel's life where we might be able to catch him if we plan it carefully. Daniel 6:5 tells us they would try to catch Daniel in following the law of God, which they knew he did. Remember, they all worshiped idols. The one who didn't worship an idol was Daniel. Here's where he differed from everybody else. So carefully planned to get rid of him by using the God he worshiped. Notice, the issue is about obedience to the law of God rather than obedience to the laws of man. Now, everybody who knew Daniel knew that he prayed 3 times a day because he prayed in an open window. It wasn't secret. He didn't try to make it secret. I'm sure people passed every day and there's Daniel praying. Nobody thought anything of it. But those trying to get rid of him, will use that practice against him. So they knew the king's ego. They thought if they could flatter the king, get him to sign a law that would keep Daniel from praying to his God, they'd have him. Because they knew no matter what law you pass about praying, Daniel is still going to pray and honor his God. This is how faithful Daniel was. Even his enemies knew that he would follow God no matter what. And so they schemed. Daniel 6:7 says, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors all agreed that should the king issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Daniel 6:8-9 says, now, your majesty, issue the decree. Can't you see this bunch of schemers bowing to the king, sucking up to the king? And now, your majesty, issue the decree, put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, all in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Verse 9, King Darius is really flattered. All these people want to just praise him for 30 days. And he signed his name to the document that they wrote. Daniel 6:3, Darius acted in the best interest of the empire, but he failed to take into account the jealousy, the pure, unadulterated envy among the Medes and Persians, among his dignitaries. When a Jew got the position that they thought belonged to them, they also couldn't stand that he was so disgustingly honest. The scheming satraps and governors flattered Darius into thinking that he was so important that folks should make requests only of him. Notice that they had the petition all ready. All they needed was the king's signature. They had Daniel. Darius didn't take time to think it through. It was just such a flattering request that he signed it. I can see them leaving so happy. They finally had Daniel. They finally could get rid of that old man. He was nothing but a slave captured in his youth, still hanging around, causing them trouble. Daniel must have heard immediately from some servant, some way, that the decree had been signed by the king. He could have prayed in his closet for the next 30 days. He could have said, oh, well, I'll avoid trouble. I'll just shut the windows or something. But that would have been hiding his faith. Instead, he kept on doing exactly what he had been doing every day before the schemers got the new law signed. He went to his open window and he prayed 3 times the next day, just like he always did. To love and serve God was more important to Daniel than whether he lived or died. As I was studying this lesson, I asked myself, if serving God is more important to me than my life, you need to ask yourself that, because you know what? If we're alive on this earth, that's exactly what will happen. We will have to want to serve God more than we want to live. That's going to be the final crisis. He was absolutely loyal to the king and to the government. He didn't lie. He didn't cheat. He didn't indulge in court gossip. He never puffed himself up because he was the third ruler in the kingdom. Nothing could keep Daniel from worshiping God. And when we worship God, we don't do all those other things. Had Daniel changed his prayer habits under pressure, he would have denied his relationship with God. Some might think this was a small thing. You know, we rationalize what we want to do or what we're afraid of. That he could have prayed secretly, he was still talking to God. No one would have known the difference. In that way, he could have avoided the lion's den. But to Daniel, obedience to God was more important. He would not give anyone the opportunity to think that he was not faithful to his God. A relationship was more important to Daniel. How important is our relationship? We're going to face the same testing that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced. There were 3 established prayer times for the Israelites. Morning burnt offering was at the 9th hour. That would have been about 9 a.m. In the afternoon at 3 p.m. and at 6 p.m. So in spite of the law, Daniel continued to pray at 9, 3, and 6. He did not change his prayer habits. He could have hidden. He could have prayed somewhere else. But then he would have been hiding the real Daniel and his real faith. The houses of Babylon had flat roofs with raised apartments on top, usually latticed windows for ventilation. This was Daniel's prayer spot and the secret of his great strength. And absolutely nothing, certainly not his cohorts, were going to keep him from worshiping God. What habits of serving God would we change if we were going to be arrested tomorrow? Ask yourself, if you were going to be arrested for coming to church today, would you have come? Do we ever give anybody the opportunity to think that we're not faithful to God? Are we afraid of wicked, jealous people around us? No, we should consider now, when our lives aren't threatened, exactly how much we believe in God and how firm we'll stand. Daniel 6, 11, and 12, then these men went as a group. Oh, they're waiting on this. They knew if he's up there at 9 a.m., we got him. They found Daniel praying. They found Daniel on his knees asking God for help. What do you think they did? I'm sure they were so excited. We got him. They went straight to the king. You spoke about the royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god, any human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. I think they deserved what comes next. I know they were excited. No longer would they have to worry about Daniel's honesty. They could cheat the king, they could skim off the top, they could get rich, and Daniel would be gone. He'd no longer be there to report them. He'd no longer be there to be honest, and they could get rich. In Daniel 6:13, they said to the king, well, Daniel, now notice what they say. Daniel's been here working in the government 80 years, well, 70 years. They got him when he was about 13 or 14, and he's now up in his 80s. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. At that point, I think Darius realized he had been trapped. He was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel. He made every effort to rescue Daniel until sundown, trying to save him. But when the sundown came and Daniel still hadn't been put into the lion's den, here comes the group again, demanding that the king keep his word. Daniel 6:15, remember your majesty, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict the king issues can be changed. Get him in the lion's den. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you, in Daniel 6:16. I wonder how jubilant those men were. I wonder how excited they were to go get Daniel and bring him to the lion's den. And what do you think Daniel did? Kicking and screaming and fighting? I don't. I think Daniel knew, and I think Daniel said, okay, let's go. Even Darius knew the secret of Daniel's success. I'm sure he knew all the stories of Nebuchadnezzar's lifetime. I'm sure he knew Daniel revealed the secrets to him. He mentioned the God that Daniel continually serves. Darius knew that Daniel's success was his continual relationship with his unseen God. Darius didn't know God, but he respected Daniel's belief and how Daniel lived. In verse 17 of chapter 6, the stone was brought that covered the entrance so Daniel would not be killed by some other means or one of them sneaking in and killing him. And it provided assurance that nobody could mess with this. It was a very complicated process. The stone sealed the entrance, then it was covered with plaster, and then seals were stamped on it. Excavations in this area show many, many samples of this practice. Daniel 6:17 and 18, the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. He could not sleep. I suppose there were entertainers every single night for the king. The king was deeply troubled that he had been tricked into condemning an innocent man to death. It was a man he trusted and respected. And yet, he hoped that Daniel's God was strong enough to save him from the lions. And I'm sure Darius, in agony all night, not eating, not being entertained, I'm sure he was saying, there's no God that can save you from the lions. I know Daniel believes this, but how's this possible? At the first light, the Bible says, the king hurried to the lion's den. There was no problem with waking up. He hadn't been asleep. And when he came near to the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, the Bible says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel said, may the king live forever. My God sent his angels, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not harmed me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. Verse 23 says the king was overjoyed and had Daniel lifted up out of the pit. And when Daniel was lifted up, absolutely unharmed, because he had trusted his God, the king was thrilled. Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, says that when his enemies saw that Daniel was saved, they said, well, he was only saved because the lions had been fed, and therefore they weren't hungry and didn't touch Daniel. And they alleged this to the king. So they're beginning to now argue with the king. Well, you put him in the lion's den, but those lions weren't hungry, or they would have torn into him. They refused to believe it was a God of heaven who had saved Daniel. And unfortunately, they found out the lions were hungry. Verse 24 says, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children and relatives. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. That's from the Bible, not my opinion. When they threw somebody in the lion's den back then, they threw all their relatives, all their kids, everybody in the family. Why is that? Because that left nobody to be upset or to plot revenge against the king. It was a brutal, bloody system. I want to show you, because we're talking about what happened in Daniel's day, and I want to show you some things that are happening in our day. The only reason, in my opinion, that it hasn't all happened is because there have been enough godly people to stop it. But there is an attempt through the United Nations, and I will show you, basically to take over the world. And you and I are in the middle of this. They are plotting carefully a one world government, a one world religion, one world monetary system. It's coming. It's not that it's far in the future. It's happening right now. And we are still living our lives as though the coming of Jesus is 500 years in the future. And it's not. It's not. We are living, in my opinion, we'll see what happens. If we're not into World War III and the coming of Jesus, I'll be stunned, because everything is happening. The prophecy has said would happen. I urge you in this few minutes that I have to read The Great Controversy. Do you all have this book? If you're listening to me on the internet or on the radio, there is a book called The Great Controversy. You can download it on your Kindle. I urge you to read it, because what Ellen White said over 100 years ago that would happen is happening, and we're living through it. Well, what I wanted to tell you, and don't have my slides to tell you, is that the United Nations, it started back in 1963, working on memory now, since I don't have my material in front of me. 1963. There was an Italian, and since I'm Italian, I'll pat him on the back. He and another man, whose name I forget, started the Club of Rome. Now, the Club of Rome has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. It's called the Club of Rome because that Italian started it in 1963 with his buddy, who was Swiss, I believe. And they began to bring together who they thought were some of the richest people in the world. Bill Gates was one on the original committee that they got together. Their idea was that nobody was taking care of anything. In other words, governments weren't doing their jobs. So they would pull 100 people. And these men, entrepreneurs, scientists, physicians, they're across a broad spectrum of the world, but they're all filthy rich. They would be the nucleus of laws and edicts and move their governments in a way to save the earth, in their opinion. The Club of Rome, from that day, about 5 years later or so, they took the map of the world, and they divided the world into 10 sections. They call those 10 sections the 10 nations. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with America being a nation and England being a nation and Russia being a nation. They've divided it. They have systematically outlined who in the United Nations should be in charge of each of these 10 nations. And these 10 nations would eventually have the power to put any agenda they decided on together. All right, that 10 nations were divided up in 1973, I believe. You can look up the United Nations 10-nation map. It'll pop right up on your screen. You can look at it yourself. Okay. This group, working with the United Nations, came up with Agenda 21 to be implemented by 2030. Now, they came up with this back in the 90s. They had a meeting in Brazil, and just about every government, I think 177 governments, 177 nations were involved. And I have a picture of George Bush signing for the United States. The goal of what he signed and what he said, and I have his comments for you if I had them, is that we would work towards a one world government in the United States. The next president was Clinton. He also signed on. See, when I tell you it doesn't matter if they're a Republican or a Democrat, and to stay out of politics, we all get dragged right into politics, just like Satan is sucking us up in a straw. Stay out of it. God is bringing us to a conclusion, to the final war. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. They've all signed on to this. The Agenda 21 now has 17 goals of sustainable development, meaning sustaining the world, developing the world, into what basically this group thinks the world should be. What they want to do is make the world socialist. It's a cross between socialism and communism. No borders. Why do you think they haven't closed the United States borders? You think it's politics? It's the United Nations. And they're probably not going to close it. But you see, they already took the borders away from all the Europe. Anybody ever traveled 20 years ago? You had to have a visa for every country. Anybody remember that? You do. You traveled. No more. Took it all, no borders. Everything's open. They want the United States open too. They want every country, no borders. Because one of their goals is the land belongs to the United Nations, not to individuals. They're aiming for a one world government, one world religion. Who do you think the United Nations has chosen to be the leader of the one world religion? I'll give you one guess. How many of you know who it is? Raise your hands. I don't have to tell you, do I, who it is? You're absolutely right. That will be the head's been chosen to be the head. So, is the Pope anxious for a Green Sabbath? Tell me this. How many of you have heard of a Green Sabbath? Raise your hands. I need to know how many of you. One? Anybody else? The Green Sabbath, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So out of all of you, there's only 8 people that have heard or know what I'm talking about. This is what I mean when I say it's under the radar and we're oblivious to it. A year ago, the Pope announced that the world needs a Green Sabbath, and everybody needs to keep Sunday as the Sabbath. Look it up. Look it up. You say it's coming in years in the future. No, it's here. And people are on this. Yes, this is what we need, a Green Sabbath for the good of the earth. They want a one world monetary system. So all our money is the same. They tried it already with the euro. And remember, Great Britain was the problem? Do you remember that? They're still trying it. They want a one world legal system, so the laws are the same everywhere. They want a one world education system. So what we learn in America is exactly the same lesson they're having in China, Africa, Finland. One world, everything. And they want a one world, what's it called? Nobody can be rich or poor. Everybody has to be equal. So the pay scale, what everybody makes, has to be exactly the same. You're not allowed to have gated communities and a very poor section of your city anymore. You say, well, that'd be a good thing. Really? What happened to communism, who had that very same idea? You see, the trouble with socialism and communism is that wicked people are in charge. And wicked people find ways to make themselves rich, just like they did with Daniel. That's why they wanted to get rid of Daniel. And the oligarchs and the governors are all wealthy, where all the other people are at their mercy. And this is what they're doing behind the scenes. Now, I'm going to ask you again. I've asked you before, because when you tell me you never heard of the Green Sabbath, then I know you're not studying. I'm going to tell you, Ellen White says it's going to break on the world as an overwhelming surprise. Her words. Why should it be a surprise to us? We're supposed to be the best Bible students in the world. Are we not? So I'm urging you, first of all, to study. Read the Great Controversy. Read it. It's happening. And we're in the middle of it. And the only reason they're fighting a war in Ukraine and not in America is because they don't think they can do it to us yet. I'm telling you, it's coming. We need to be ready. You say, well, I'll prepare. I'll buy a house I'll save up all my gold and silver, and I'll buy a piece of land in the mountains, and then you can't do it. Ellen White says this: make no preparation